Join me in welcoming Veronica Moore today. She is an Associate Director, Research and Development Global Patient Advocate at Horizon Therapeutics. Veronica has had over 15 years combined experience in the rare disease arena, spanning from patient advocacy and engagement, health equity, community health education, and patient recruitment. Veronica is an active board member of the Hypersomnia Foundation as well, and today our conversation focuses on the imbalances and inequity in the healthcare system, how to self-advocate for yourself, but also recognizing that sometimes that is extremely difficult, especially if you're a person living with idiopathic hypersomnia. So let's get into our conversation with Veronica. Veronica Moore, it's always so good to have a moment with you, and I know I've got the next sort of 30 minutes, so welcome to our Living With series. I'd love to thank you for joining us as a member of the Hypersomnia Foundation board, but you're also an experienced patient director in advocacy, health equity, inclusion, and a public health educator. So I have to ask two things. Why do you do all those things? And I also want to ask how you do all those things, but maybe the why first.
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for having me join today. It's always a pleasure to connect and catch up and chat with you. And I'm just so thankful to be a part of the hypersomnia community and serving as a board member. What you're asking is, what is my why? Why I'm in rare and why I do the things that I do as it relates to advocacy, equity, and inclusion. And the reason of that is because of what you see in front of you. I am a woman of color from a rural community, and a woman that has a lived experience of rare disease in multiple capacities. So it is critically important for me to ensure that the work that I do professionally impacts and expands beyond what I do and bleeds over to my professional life. A lot of us, as we pick careers and paths from a professional lens, we're inspired, right, from our personal experiences and things that really make us tick and keep us motivated to wake up every day and to really thrive and push through those dark and crazy and stressful days, right? So I lost my mom from a rare disease at the age of 11, and it inspired me to take the path professionally to work in the space of public health and medical sociology. It inspired me to making sure that I have a career path where I'm always serving, and service, commitment, and really activism to giving a voice to those that don't have a voice or don't have the platform to share their voice as it relates to healthcare. Healthcare is one commonality that all of us across the world experience or interact in some way. So it was just an easy marrying blend of moving my advocacy work and passion and bleeding that over to what I do from my 9 to 5, and also what I do outside of work as well for my personal passion projects. I hope I answered that question in a little bit of breadth and depth there, but I'm just in a serving capacity, and anything that I can do to support patients or communities that have been historically marginalized or underserved, I will lose sleep, no pun intended, to making sure that I can do that in the best way for individuals that look like me and even those that don't.
Right. I've seen that in you consistently for years. So thank you so much for your contribution in both sort of a professional and a personal capacity. And I know there's a lot of blend there. There's a lot of overlap. Could you say a little bit more about both? Like, what does that advocacy look like in both professional and a personal context?
Yes, absolutely. So in my 9 to 5 career job that I do to, pay the bills and keep the lights on, I am an associate director of patient advocacy at a biotech company that is focused on rare, rheumatic, and severe inflammatory diseases. And in my everyday, I work with patient advocates and patient advocacy organizations to help ensure that their voice and the lived experience informs, empowers, and is embedded into what we do as a business as far as finding treatments and modalities that will be life-changing to the patients and the community and the support that they are seeking to get in this way. Also working to making sure that we are elevating and amplifying patient stories. The power of patient stories is immeasurable, and it really empowers us to have a humanistic lens to the nerdy research work that we do in pharmaceutical companies and biotechs. But the power of patient stories, I always tell patients, never shadow down or water down your story. Never think it's an awkward or an uncomfortable space to share your story. Every minute you have an opportunity to do so in an authentic way, go for it. Outside of my 9 to 5, I do a few things, and I'll touch on a few of those things. Serving in the capacity of my community. So I am a member of the North Carolina Serious Illness Coalition, working in North Carolina where there's extreme disparities as far as individuals getting access to equitable care has been pivotal to me because I have family members that still live in rural, North Carolina. I have personal friends that have lived in the poorest county in North Carolina and have family members that still are there with chronic and rare diseases that are still fighting every day to get the appropriate treatment, diagnosis, and education to empower them to get access to information. So in addition, I do work at Duke University in the Translational Science Division, working as a community advisor to think about what are the best ways to engage a community that has been historically marginalized. And as we think about patient recruitment and patient engagement, what strategies and tactics will be best utilized in those ways? And then what community stakeholders should we bring to the table as we are co-creating, co-developing research and information in that way? I also am a graduate of an HBCU, the North Carolina Central University. So whenever I have a moment and opportunity to mentor early career individuals that are interested in public health and advocacy, I have a tribe of young adults that I mentor to making sure that they have the pathway to have opportunity to entry point into advocacy, no matter if that's nonprofit space, pharma, biotech space, or even in any other philanthropic space. And I am a true believer that you can't be what you don't see. So me being a woman of color, working in pharma, I've worked at UNC Chapel Hill, I've worked in private health, public health consulting firm entities. I've worked at health departments. I've had such a wide, diverse remit of my professional career. I see it as very critically important for me to afford those opportunities and to pay it forward for early career and college students to making sure they have the equitable exposure to all the ways that you can be an advocacy professional and still have a good quality of life and balance as well. Those are just a few things I do.
Okay, let's maybe we'll just want to go back a little bit because I do wonder how you strike work-life balance, but maybe that's another question for another time. It seems like you do it so well and effortlessly, but that's a lot. And very pioneering, actually, Veronica, isn't it? But can we just perhaps go back to what you were talking about, the power of patient stories in your professional life? Because do you see a change there? Like, say 5 years ago, was there a different sort of ethos around how researchers, clinicians, all sorts of agents and KOLs like listen to the patients? Do you feel there's been a shift?
Absolutely. I think there's been a shift systemically of why patient insights is so important, not only just for science and research, but for everyone in the healthcare ecosystem to understand the lived experience. Individuals that are in healthcare are there to do no harm, right? And to serve. But in order to do that, you have to come with a space of empathy and knowledge. And the clinical knowledge is just as important, and the patient knowledge of the experience and lived experience is just as equally important as the scientific knowledge. And now as a healthcare community, including patient advocacy groups, we're now understanding the value of patient stories and the value of understanding all of those modalities and all the considerations, even beyond the disease in itself, that impacts how a patient shows up in a clinic setting, how they show up at home for their family in that way. I think there's been a big strive and move for the power of patient stories and the value of sharing lived experiences that even extends beyond a disease, because we have a responsibility now to think about whole patient care. And whole patient care encompasses like not only because a patient has hypersomnia that they're not able to work, but there's also psychosocial impacts and how that bleeds over to the family ecosystem. That if a young lady is experiencing chronic symptoms as it relates to her hypersomnia, that she's unable to care and to be a partner which she desires to be. So that has psychosocial impacts. And if you think about systems, we're in this society to be, good deeds and stewards of the community. And if you're unwell and it trickles down to your psychosocial impact, you really can't show up for yourself and or for your family members. And healthcare is now starting to take mental health seriously, which I am tremendously excited and thankful for, because this has been highly stigmatized, highly siloed, but now we are embedding mental health into rare disease, which is tremendous. And the reason why that has happened, in my personal opinion, is because patients have come forward with stories. They've shared the impact from a psychosocial impact of living with rare diseases, which is so important for us to understand.
Where do you see sort of the most effective platforms for patients to share their stories? So if someone in our audience hopefully is listening and thinking, yes, I have things to say about impacts, things aren't going well at home, and I don't get to speak about, my social life or, my job or driving with my doctor, where are the best places for patients to show up and tell their story in a way that is understood and heard by the people that need to hear and understand it?
Absolutely. I have a few ideas and a few suggestions, and
Yeah,
I think it has to be, of course, I come with ideas all the
Of course.
time.
I love it. Of course.
One thing is like, it's always good to start in that safe space where you have community, right? So for someone that is an introvert and to say, oh, you should go to YouTube and share your story and go to Instagram, that may not be the first pass stop, right? That may not be the first landing space where it's really authentic, safe, and comfortable for the individual. I want to challenge people to think about salons, hair salons, barbershops, churches, civic groups in your community. If you have a coffee chat group that you're a running club, sharing your story in a space that is already safe for you is always a good starting spot.
Okay.
I am always elated to reach people in random places. I travel extensively for work, and you will not believe how many lives I've touched with my story, or just random conversations in airports and hotels when they ask, well, what do you do for a living? And tell me about that. What about rare disease? And I have my pitch ready and locked and loaded in an organic fashion. But I really don't want to devalue, and I want to make sure individuals that are listening today that sharing your story at that same grocery store you go to every Thursday to pick up flowers and your meats, and sharing your story in your local faith-based setting, sharing your story in the space that you get your hair done or your brows done every month in that way. And no audience is too big or small. We immediately go to the big grand platforms to sharing stories, but just as, individuals living with rare diseases or individuals just navigating life with a chronic disease, it's a process, right? So sharing your story should have that same mechanism where it's a process of sharing your story in that way. Of course, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, we know now with some of the ways that individuals receive information and process, the small bites, like was it TikTok? I'm not on TikTok, but it's so helpful to audience readers who don't have a lot of time but can get small bites of information as well. Those type of mechanisms have been really helpful. But then the other piece is making sure your story is embedded in the patient advocacy group or the community group that you're affiliated with, such as the Hypersomnia Foundation. So if you are an individual living with hypersomnia, highly encourage for you to put that on the list somewhere. It could be number 8, and maybe you have to go through the other 7 channels first to get comfortable to sharing your story with the foundation, because that's a much larger platform of community and reach. But really making sure that if you do have a diverse story, or if you do have a compelling story, to share it with your advocacy group organizations, because the modalities and ways that they can amplify that sometimes are much larger and even more efficient than if you were to do that lift on your own.
Yeah, so we can actually support people if they're a bit nervous about TikTok or social media. So thank you for saying that. And I think you're right.
Absolutely.
It's important to find what people are comfortable with while being authentic, because that's what's going to give longevity and power. So you don't wear a t-shirt or anything that says, speak to me about sleep disorders. I'm your person when you're at, when you're at JFK or anything, no?
No, I don't. I think people don't know what rare diseases are, and it's always like an enlightening conversation to talk about what is a rare disease. And they have family members with disease, and it's like, I'm like, that is a rare disease, and they had no idea. And now they're able to connect and go back and do research and find ways to give back for that family member that they lost, or family member that is still suffering. And when we think about advocacy, it's not a descriptive, it is an action-driven word. So advocacy in my is like, yes, I rest, I do, because I wear a lot of hats, I rest, but advocacy is an ongoing activity. And I think that needs to be keeping in consideration as you're telling your story, that there's other ways to keep that ball rolling, and storytelling is one of those mechanisms.
Right. And for more formal advocacy, the Hypersomnia Foundation is also involved on the Hill with Project Sleep. So there's lots of opportunities actually to lean in if you want something more formal or support with social media. But as you say, the power of just your authentic living in your neighborhood is really quite something. I was wearing a t-shirt actually with narcolepsy, World Narcolepsy Day, to pickleball last week, and I was surprised. I was surprised about the amount of comments that I got, and they were really random. Like they were all directions. So if you do kind of go out into the neighborhood with the right t-shirt on, then be prepared to answer some pretty wild questions. But it was a good opportunity. So thanks for saying that. Now, Veronica, you talked about the psychosocial impact, and I'd love to explore what you mean by that, particularly sort of domestically, because I think this is an area that's sort of coming up a little bit. It's been traditionally neglected. We talk about advocacy more formally publicly, but what does it mean to advocate for yourself in your home life and in your relationships, and to show up as sort of to self-advocate in those really vulnerable places?
Yeah. So for me, showing up and really advocating it's so easy when you have so much on your plate yourself to kind of just stay quiet and muted when you see other individuals that are not getting equitable access and care, because you have this, gigantic list of things that you have to deal with yourself. Myself, I'm unpartnered. I'm a mother of a 9-year-old son. And I think even though I still have those, responsibilities in my personal life, I still have to make space and try to find balance, that those patients that I hear with their stories, that if I come across someone that is struggling with depression or anxiety, and also going down that diagnosis journey where they still not for sure certain what they have, that connecting them with some of the mental health resources that are available, and some that are free of charge or can do a sliding scale, which the financial burden will be released for them to get care in that way. I think the other piece is making sure that we are taking up space and allowing space for individuals that they're in a different phase of their journey of living with a rare disease is important. We go to conferences sometimes within certain diseases, and you have a segment of patients that are really empowered. They've been living with the disease for maybe 3 or 4 years. They have it all nailed down of all the resources. And then you see that shy first-time conference attendee, right? I ran across one at our conference this spring.
Yes,
and you could see them being so overwhelmed, where some have never met another patient living with their condition. And they're there so thirsty and eager for information, for knowledge, and for comfort. And how do you kind of balance out those two in an audience where you have a patient that's highly empowered, highly knowledgeable, and has all the resources, and then is on a great appropriate path for managing their disease in the best way. But then you have that early diagnosed patient and making sure that those mental health resources are so important. And I think when we think about intersectionality, as far as like we are not only just patients, but some of us are mothers, we are caregivers, we are professionals, we are, entrepreneurs in that way. And the common thread is that we all have multiple considerations of how we show up in society and how we desire to be viewed. And the common thread is compassion too. And when we think about compassion, we could think about some of the patient advocacy groups and why some of these organizations have come to the inceptions, because from a patient compassion, they haven't lived experience or were impacted by the disease and were tenacious enough to go and start a nonprofit to create a safe space for other individuals who have that lived experience as well.
Yeah. Yes, I appreciate you saying that. Those seasons are so distinct, aren't they? And we all relate to those first months and years where you're just gathering information, whether you're a person with rare disease or a supporter. And it is a little overwhelming, but also super comforting to be in the presence of like your kin, your tribe. And then you're on this journey of like discovery and kind of empowerment, I suppose. So yeah, to your point about the conference, I'd really recommend everyone joins us. And next year we will be in Houston the first weekend of June. So please do join us for that, because it's really something to sit in a room with over 250 people that you can relate to. It's quite unique. Thank you for that. I also wanted to touch on access to medication, because you're also an expert on that. And one of our shared passions, Veronica, is we know there's limited medications for people with IH, but there's also huge barriers to access. So can you speak to your work on that, and any advice you can give our community would be super.
Yeah, so, I've been working in the rare disease space for over 13, 14 years. I'm dating myself a little bit there. But the common thread is that this has always been at the top of a barrier. It has not moved since I've been in this space. And unfortunately, it keeps me up at night. It really does, thinking about the inequities of accessing medications and treatments for patients living with rare diseases. One thing that I think that has elevated over the past 5 years significantly is payer literacy. And what I mean by payer literacy, similar to health literacy, but you work with insurance companies, you work with your doctor, and they're really throwing out a lot of lingo out that you really don't understand. It's a little muddy. But I think, the patient advocacy community, organizations such as the Hypersomnia Foundation is doing a fantastic knockout job of laying out some of this foundational knowledge of what payer literacy is in this way. So any patients that is watching this podcast and is having access challenges to medicines, I would highly, shameless plug, encourage you to go to our Hypersomnia Foundation and look under some of our access information, because having that foundation knowledge about what is letter of medical necessity, what is an EOB, in that way was an explanation of benefits. Really understanding what you're signing up for from a health insurance policy is important, so that you can navigate the system and navigate the challenges and roadmaps in the most appropriate and informed way. The other piece is that at the state level, I think some individuals highly encourage you to do some due diligence on who you're voting for in your local government entities, because it definitely has a direct benefit and challenge sometimes to how things are moving from a policy piece for you getting access to information. So I always encourage, if you're a person living with a rare disease or even a chronic disease, getting to know your local representative on a government level is critical. And sharing your story, shameless plug, sharing your story at the state government level is even more important as well, because you have people fighting and advocating for you in rooms that you're not in. And access is a common thread topic at the state level as well. The other piece I would say is also thinking about, how do I ensure that whatever I'm doing for access to medicines, that you also are understanding the disease manifestations, because sometimes we come across patients at the Hypersomnia Foundation where there's a drug available, it's FDA approved, and you may be a little frustrated about why you can't get access to the information, to the medication. And some of that could be tied to how the clinical trials were set up leading up to the drug getting approval. And the pharmaceutical companies may still be doing some due diligence and follow-up trials and research to extend the label of the drug as well. So that still goes back to some of the health literacy and payer literacy piece of understanding the drug approval process, to understanding how insurance interacts with some of these medications and processes being approved for patients as well. The other piece is that if patients are struggling with access to medications, pharmaceutical companies definitely appreciate and come from a space of empathy and appreciation for you sharing your story of access barriers as well. So if there's a platform or a channel to connect with pharmaceutical companies to share your story of access challenges, because they don't know what they don't know in this way. So once again, another example of how patient stories can help support access to medicines as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think there's two things I want to say there. One is that there are glossaries. And this is more of a call to action for clinicians than it is to patients, but to sort of, to de-jargon an appointment would be really helpful. But there are
Absolutely.
also lots of glossaries out there if people are struggling to understand. We shouldn't have that barrier with medical lingo. Okay, so the other thing is that talking about equity, coming from that last question, equity for change in rest sleep, Veronica. What do you think that looks like, sort of from an evolutionary point of view, going forward, say, the next 5 years?
Oh man, I think equity in sleep is such an important topic. And when COVID happened and everything shut down, I'll just take that for example. When COVID shut down and people were challenged with how to reevaluate how they exist in systems, how they show up for themselves and their family and their community during a very stressful and uncertain time, sleep became a topic. And if you look at the literature and the media, people start seeing like, okay, I used to be on the go all the time. I was on the grind, and now systemically, I have to pause. I have to evaluate my health. At that time, we had so many people focusing on health and wellness, and sleep became a topic. When we think about sleep equity, as far as at that point in time, there was a lot of conversation and space around the intersectionality of living with a rare disease or a sleep disorder and what that means. And it was so empowering to see people that have never thought about hypersomnia really come with a space of compassion and come into our community to say, how can I help? I now have empathy and information, and now I can act to be an ally because I don't have hypersomnia. I am fortunate that I wake up and I feel well rested. And now that I've had this time to pause and to have more information about what hypersomnia is, I want to be an ally. So I think over the past course of 3 years, we've talked about sleep, and sleep from the place of where we've been forced to rest in some respect when we were in quarantine. But when we think about 5 years from now, I think we are going to start seeing more intersectionality of rare disease and how it impacts sleep outcomes. Like we know scientifically, there are some diseases where the symptoms of hypersomnia could also be present with other chronic diseases and other rare diseases. So now that people are now being aware of this, there's research being done and communities are starting to come together in this way to better understand it. Like, for example, in lupus, for example, patients deal with brain fog a lot. So now they're being evaluated for some of these sleep disorders while living with an autoimmune condition as well.
Right.
So, when you think about hypersomnia, you may have new community members coming to you in the next couple of years where they say, I have hypersomnia and another autoimmune condition. And that's going to be very empowering and exciting because there's going to be even more collaborative research being done, I feel like, in my personal opinion, that is going to be groundbreaking and really driving towards collective equity across various disease states globally,
Right.
because we know sleep is perceived and operated and actioned upon in a multitude of ways based on the culture, region, demographics, and who you're speaking to.
Yeah, I think you're right that COVID was a great accelerator, wasn't it, in many ways, but it also put a spotlight on sleep. And with the WHO recognizing sleep as a pillar health, and now 4Post already as an organization, which puts sleep disorders front and center. It's really interesting because I wonder if, we're going to see so many more. I think this is already happening. You already pointed to the fact that you could have a primary diagnosis outside of a traditional sleep diagnosis. And yes, you're absolutely right. We're seeing people say with a primary diagnosis of epilepsy or Prader-Willi or Parkinson's or dementia or something like that. But actually, they do have, say, symptoms of excessive daytime sleeping. And this is really new. It's a huge shift whereby I think there's going to be sleep front and center also, even if you've got a diagnosis outside of a traditional sleep one. And all thanks to your kind of work. And I know, talking about rest during COVID, both of you, when we had a conversation a few weeks ago, Veronica kind of fangirled the Nat Bishop. So I thought that was such a good sort of, well, it's really worth raising the work of Tricia Hersey of the Nat Ministry. She's really prevalent over social ministry, but she does talk about grind culture. And a little bit touches on the patriarchy. She's got a fantastic book, and we both really connected over her work because she's really sort of trying to smash this resistance to rest. How do you practice resistance to rest in your own life?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. It is still a practice. I have not perfected it. One quote that I live by now in my own mantra every day is saying no so I can make room for those big yes. And saying no is so important because rest is resistance, as she said. And one thing that I've done is a quote in her book, and it says, release the shame you feel when resting. It does not belong to you. And I think that resonates with the community that I serve in the Hypersomnia Foundation, where sometimes we experience self-guilt when we're resting, or self-guilt that we are missing out on family activities because we have to take, a midday nap. We know the hypersomnia community has to schedule their naps from, based on what's appropriate for each individual. But release that shame to feel when you're resting. And releasing that shame to say, no, I cannot do it. I can't do these 3 other meetings today because I have to get to bed at 8 o'clock. And that's okay. It's okay to say no. I think that has been really pivotal for me. And it's been a process for me personally to say no, because there's so many fantastic things, so many things that are serving others, but I can't serve anyone else if I don't serve myself. And that's where rest is so important. And it should not be shamed by no means. So whenever we hear people being belittled or devalued in the hypersomnia community because they have to take a wellness nap or have to take rest, and whatever rest looks like for them, remove that shame. And we should be speaking up as a community. If we witness that or hear that in any respect, in any avenue, rest is truly resistance. And it's resistance to this capitalistic world that we live in, where we're forced to be always on the go, grinding. If you're not working 14, 16 hours a day, you're not being, a productive citizen. And I'm here to tell you that is a lie. That is a lie. So I just want to make sure that the constituents of the foundation understand that rest is truly resistance.
And wellness, as you said. And I think there's so many layers there, because even putting sleep issues aside, because one of the things that the Nat Bishop does so well, Tricia, is to really enter that dialogue between health and wellness and sleep disorders. But even if you don't have a sleep disorder, that this is something that's really important for our health. And it's a practice, isn't it, not to feel shamed and guilt around that. It's actually a practice because we're conditioned to, as you say, grind away. And I think as women also, it's just extremely layered because, you know, there's that expectation of working full time. And as you mentioned earlier, potentially being entrepreneurial, but also you're a mum, single mum like me. And then you've got health disorders thrown in there. So thank you for saying that. It's extremely validating. And I think this may warrant a second conversation, Veronica, but I'm glad we touched on it and would love to hear from our audience, actually, if you have any views on some of the topics we've said, because this could be or should be an ongoing conversation. And Veronica and I would be happy to meet you at our conferences next year. It would be super. I could just go on and on and on talking to you and give you a big hug when I see you, but thank you so much for your work, your dedication, the impact you have on your local and the whole of the states, actually. Your work goes right the way around outside of your local vicinity. So, and of course, your contribution to the Hypersomnia Foundation. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for your leadership for the foundation. Your allyship as a woman, as a white woman, your allyship to communities that have been historically marginalized. I really appreciate you taking up space and advocating for everyone that look like you and don't, and even those beyond rare diseases. So we really appreciate you being a champion of all things sleep.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, thank you.